Get out of my house, old man. Victoria Sterling's voice cracked through the ruins of her childhood home. Her Hermes heels clicked against warped floorboards, a billionaire's power colliding with soot and dust. But the man in her father's recliner didn't move. Scarred hands placed a photograph on the table, a little girl with blue ribbons in her hair. Victoria froze. Nobody alive knew about those ribbons. You think I'm trespassing, his voice steady. But I've been waiting for you, Victoria. The cameras rolled. The assistants whispered. And the CEO's perfect life was about to unravel. Because tonight, the man she called a nobody was about to expose everything. This is Black Stories, where the pain of prejudice is told and justice always finds its voice. If this story of a billionaire's cruel dismissal of an elderly black veteran stirs your anger, keep watching to see how one forgotten photograph became the catalyst for a revelation that not even Victoria's perfect corporate facade could have survived. Hit like, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Elijah Brooks wasn't a stranger who wandered into those ruins. He'd been part of her life long before that terrible night changed everything. He'd worn 2 uniforms in his life, the Army's first, the school's second. A Gulf War veteran with burn scars the VA never quite fixed, Elijah had spent over 20 years as the school janitor down the road. He showed up before dawn and stayed when things were on fire. Sometimes literally. Quiet work, invisible work that kept the community running. But to Sarah Sterling, Victoria's mother, he was more than just the neighborhood janitor. He was the neighbor she trusted when her husband was away on business trips. The kind man she'd share peppermint candy with on the porch, while little Victoria played hopscotch in the driveway, her blue ribbons catching the afternoon light. Elijah remembered those blue ribbons because he'd watched Sarah tie them every morning with such care. He remembered the music box because Sarah had once laughed, telling him that little Vicky would hum herself to sleep before the lullaby even finished playing. That's why, on the night everything changed, when Mrs. Henderson saw the flames and panic overtook her, it was Elijah's number she dialed. Not the fire department first. Not Robert Sterling, who was supposedly in Chicago. She called Elijah because she knew, without question, that he would come running. And he did. Straight into the flames that would leave scars on more than just his body. Now, 21 years later, Elijah had remained silent through it all. He'd been branded a liar, a thief, even a suspect. The community that had once known him as a reliable, hard-working man began to whisper. But he endured it all, carrying the weight of the truth alone. When he saw Victoria's face on the evening news, her announcement about demolishing her childhood home for a luxury development, something snapped into place. Demolition was scheduled for Friday morning, and Elijah realized that if he stayed silent, the truth would be buried forever under concrete and steel. So he came back to the only place left that still held the smell of smoke and memories. Not to trespass. Not to beg for recognition. But to finally keep a promise he'd made to Sarah Sterling in those final moments. Make sure my little girl remembers who she is. Victoria's phone clattered to the floor as she stared at the photograph in his weathered hands. Where did you get this? Her voice was barely a whisper. Your mother. Elijah's weathered fingers traced the edge of the photo with reverence. This was on your nightstand the night of the fire. I grabbed it when I... He stopped himself, the memory still too painful. When I went into your room to get you out. You were in my room? Victoria's voice cracked with disbelief. Without answering directly, Elijah stood slowly and walked to the fireplace mantel. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he picked up something Victoria hadn't noticed before. A small, paint-chipped music box that somehow looked familiar. You had this too, he said softly. Even with all that smoke filling the house, I could hear it playing through your bedroom door. His scarred fingers found the tiny key and began to wind it slowly. It helped me find you in all that chaos. The first notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star began to tinkle through the devastated room. The melody hit Victoria like a physical blow, unlocking something that had been buried deep in her mind for over 2 decades. Suddenly, she could smell the acrid smoke again, could feel strong arms lifting her small body, could hear a voice whispering through the chaos. I got you, baby girl. You're safe now. That's impossible, she gasped, her perfectly controlled facade cracking. I would remember. You were 7 years old. Elijah's voice was gentle but firm. Smoke inhalation knocked you unconscious before I could get to you. Your lungs were filling with poison, but even unconscious, you kept humming this song. That's how I knew you were still fighting. Behind her, Caleb stepped forward nervously. Sir, I need you to leave. Mrs. Sterling has a schedule. Mrs. Sterling? Elijah's laugh held 21 years of bitter irony. Her name was Vicky then. Sweet little girl with blue ribbons in her pigtails that her mama tied every morning before school. His eyes found Victoria's. And she had a birthmark. Right here. He pointed to his left shoulder blade. Victoria's hand instinctively moved to her own shoulder, where a small crescent-shaped birthmark hid beneath her designer blouse. Nobody knew about that mark. Her father had never mentioned it. Her few childhood friends wouldn't remember such a detail. Nobody except... Who are you? She whispered, though part of her was beginning to understand. Elijah rolled up his left sleeve with deliberate slowness, revealing the answer written in scar tissue. Burn scars ran from his wrist to his elbow, thick and ropey, the kind that never fully heal because they cut too deep. 21 years ago, I carried you out of this house when it was burning, he said simply. Your mama died in that room behind you, trying to save evidence that would expose your father. And your father... His voice hardened. He made sure you'd never know I was the one who saved you. No, no, no. Victoria shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair coming loose as her world began to crumble. My father said the fire department rescued me. Your father wasn't even supposed to be in town that night, Elijah cut through her protests like a surgeon cutting away infected tissue. He told everyone he was in Chicago on business. Left you with Mrs. Henderson from next door. Mrs. Henderson. The name hit Victoria like a forgotten song. Suddenly she could smell peppermint candy and hear the gentle sound of knitting needles clicking together. The elderly babysitter who always hummed while she worked, who kept butterscotch candies in her apron pocket. Mrs. Henderson called me when she saw the flames through her kitchen window, Elijah continued, his voice carrying the weight of a story he'd kept locked away for decades. I was working late at the school. Janitor's work never really stops. Waxing floors, fixing broken things. He paused, looking at his scarred hands. I ran here in my work boots. Didn't even think about it. Just knew a little girl was in danger. Victoria closed her eyes, and for the first time in 21 years, she let herself remember. Not the sanitized version her father had fed her, but the real memory fighting to surface. Strong arms carrying her through smoke and darkness. A voice promising, I got you, baby girl, I got you, as the world burned around them. What's your name? Victoria whispered, though she realized she should have asked this question first. Elijah. Elijah Brooks. He gestured to the photograph still lying on the table. I've kept this for 21 years, along with that music box. Figured someday you'd need to remember who you were before you became all this. He gestured at her expensive clothes, her entourage, the cameras. Behind her, Caleb whispered urgently into his phone, Cancel the press release. We have a situation. If you saved me, Victoria said slowly, trying to process information that rewrote her entire understanding of her life. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Why don't I remember you? Elijah's laugh was hollow, carrying decades of disappointment and systemic injustice. You think they put a black janitor on the front page as a hero? Your daddy had a story to tell, and it didn't include someone like me. What no one in that room realized was that Elijah wasn't just a forgotten hero seeking recognition. Behind that moment of revelation was a deeper truth that would not only shatter Victoria's understanding of her life, but expose a decades-old conspiracy that destroyed dozens of families. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She could suddenly recall the newspaper clippings her father had carefully preserved and shown her over the years. Stories of brave firefighters, community heroes rallying together, the tragic loss of a young mother. But there had never been any mention of a janitor named Elijah Brooks. Never a word about the man whose scars told the real story. After I got you out safely, I went back for your mama, Elijah continued, his voice growing quieter as he relived the worst night of his life. Found her in the bedroom, but it was too late. When the paramedics finally arrived, they found me unconscious in the hallway, burns covering half my body from trying to reach her. Victoria's stomach churned as she began to understand the full scope of the injustice. But instead of being called a hero, Elijah's voice carried a bitter edge. They said I was trying to steal something from the house. Police questioned me for 3 hours in that hospital bed before they'd even let the doctors properly treat these burns. 3 hours of interrogation while my skin was still smoking. That's not... People aren't... Victoria started to protest, but the words died in her throat. Aren't what? Racist? Elijah stood up slowly, his joints creaking from old injuries and older injustices. Child, I spent 2 months in that hospital. Lost my job at the school because I missed too much work recovering. Your daddy never visited, never called, never even sent a thank you card. The music box continued its haunting melody as Victoria sank onto the old couch, dust rising around her like ghosts of the past. Her mind reeled with the implications of everything she was learning. I don't understand, she said weakly. If what you're saying is true, why are you here now? Why tell me this after all these years? Because you're about to tear down the only place that still holds the real truth, Elijah said simply, his eyes moving to the walls around them. And because I made your mama a promise that night, and I've never been one to break my word. Victoria looked up at him, something stirring in her memory. A woman's face swimming up through decades of suppressed recollections. Kind eyes, the same stubborn chin she saw when she looked in mirrors. What promise? She asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. That I'd make sure you remembered who you really are. Not who your father wanted you to become, but who Sarah Sterling's daughter was meant to be. As he spoke, Elijah moved to the fireplace and pressed his thumb into a loose mortar line. After a moment of gentle pressure, a brick shifted. Your mama was smarter than your father knew, he said, working the brick free from its hiding place. She knew she was in danger. So she left insurance. From the hidden space behind the brick, Elijah withdrew a plastic-wrapped bundle and a small digital recorder, items that had waited over 2 decades to see the light. Bank ledgers, client names, transfer records, and he held up the recorder. Her voice. Her final testimony. Victoria's hand shook as she unsealed pages covered in her father's familiar handwriting. Dates, amounts, theft documented in meticulous detail. Each entry represented a family destroyed, a retirement lost, a child's college fund stolen. Then Elijah clicked play on the recorder, and Sarah Sterling's voice filled the room. Urgent, frightened, but determined. If you're hearing this, Robert killed me. Give this evidence to the FBI. Tell my Vicky that I love her more than anything in this world. Tell her that doing what's right is always worth the cost, no matter how high. The music box went still. For the first time in 21 years, it wasn't just memory drowning Victoria. It was truth, pure and devastating. Victoria stood on trembling legs, the documents from her mother's hiding place still clutched against her chest like a shield against everything she thought she knew about her life. What do you want from me? She asked, falling back on the language of business deals and transactions. Money? Recognition? What's your price? Elijah's response cut through her defensive posturing like a knife. I don't want anything from you, Victoria Sterling. I wanted something from the little girl I saved that night. I wanted her to remember that a nobody cared enough to risk everything for her. I'm not that little girl anymore. Victoria's voice cracked with desperation. No, Elijah agreed, his voice carrying profound sadness as he looked at what she'd become. You're not. That little girl had compassion. She would have said thank you. The word shattered something inside Victoria's chest. 21 years of buried guilt, of living with a hole where her childhood should have been, of building an empire on the grave of her mother's sacrifice. Suddenly she could see her mother's face clearly for the first time in decades, could hear her voice reading bedtime stories, could feel gentle hands tying blue ribbons in her hair with infinite patience and love. This is my house, she said weakly, clinging to the last threads of the narrative that had sustained her. I'm buying it to build something beautiful for the community. Your house? Elijah's laugh was bitter but tinged with sadness rather than anger. Child, this house died the night your mama did. I'm just here to make sure you remember what was buried in the ashes before it's gone forever. At that moment, Caleb appeared at her elbow, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Ma'am, the investors are waiting in the conference call. We need to... Victoria turned to look at Caleb's perfectly manicured hand on her arm, then at Elijah's scarred fingers still holding her mother's photograph. In that instant, she could hear her mother's voice from the recording echoing in her mind. Tell Victoria I love her, and that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. Get your hand off me, she said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that had nothing to do with corporate power. Caleb stepped back, startled by the change in her tone. Shut up about the investors, Victoria screamed, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. Don't you understand? None of it matters. The money, the deals, the reputation. It's all built on blood money and lies. Her words echoed through the empty house just as the front door burst open. Harsh television lights flooded the room as reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones, drawn by the commotion and the scent of a breaking story. Mrs. Sterling, can you comment on the delayed development announcement? Who is this man you're meeting with? Is it true you're having second thoughts about the project? Victoria squinted in the sudden glare, her tear-streaked face exposed to the world for the first time without makeup, without preparation, without the armor of her carefully crafted public image. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. The woman who'd walked into this house an hour ago, protected by designer clothes and corporate power, no longer existed. Get them out, she shouted. But even as the words left her mouth, she realized she didn't mean them. Elijah stepped directly into the camera lights, his scarred hand steady, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. My name is Elijah Brooks, he said, looking directly into the nearest camera. 21 years ago, I saved this woman's life. The cameras swung toward him like predators sensing fresh prey, and Victoria felt her carefully constructed world tilting sideways as she realized there was no going back from this moment. This house burned down in October 1995. I carried 7-year-old Victoria Sterling out of these flames while her mother died in that back room trying to expose the truth. He pointed behind Victoria, who instinctively stepped away from the spot, suddenly remembering the smell of smoke. Victoria watched her perfectly managed life unraveling in real time as social media notifications lit up phones throughout the room. 21 years of careful image management dissolving in seconds. Mrs. Sterling, is this true? Why haven't you mentioned this hero before in any of your interviews? What was he doing in your house today? Are you planning to honor him in your development project? Victoria opened her mouth to speak but found herself drowning again. Not in smoke this time, but in the suffocating weight of lies she'd unknowingly lived with for decades. The walls seemed to close in, just like when she was 7 and couldn't breathe. But this time, instead of running from the suffocation, she made a different choice. She chose to breathe through it and speak the truth. Enough! Her voice cracked like a whip through the chaos. The reporters stepped back, stunned by the raw authority in her voice. Kill the press release, Victoria told her team, her voice steady for the first time all day. Cancel the development project. If we speak to the media, we speak the complete truth. On record, with his name and his story first. She turned to face Elijah fully, no longer caring about the cameras capturing every tear, every moment of her transformation. You want the truth, Mr. Brooks? All of it? Then let's give them the truth. The room held its collective breath as Victoria Sterling, billionaire CEO, prepared to destroy everything she'd built. I don't remember you, Victoria began, her voice growing stronger with each word as she found her footing in honesty. I don't remember the fire. I don't remember my mother dying. I've spent 21 years living with a hole in my memory the size of my entire childhood. Elijah started to speak, perhaps to offer comfort, but Victoria held up her hand. Don't make excuses for me, she said firmly. You want to know why I don't remember? Because I chose not to. Because every time I tried to remember that night, all I could feel was overwhelming guilt. The reporters frantically scribbled notes and held up recording devices, but Victoria was speaking to Elijah now, not to them. Survivor's guilt. My therapist called it survivor's guilt. My mother died and I lived, and somewhere deep in my 7-year-old mind, I knew it wasn't fair. So I buried everything. The fire, the smoke, the fear, and I buried you along with it all. Elijah took a step toward her, his expression softening with understanding. Victoria, but you didn't forget me, she continued, tears streaming freely down her face. You kept that photograph for 21 years. You kept the music box. You carried my trauma and the truth so I didn't have to, even when it cost you everything. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to have stopped their mechanical whirring. I owe you my life, Victoria whispered, her voice breaking, and until today I never even knew your name. There's more, Elijah said quietly, reaching into his jacket with the careful movements of a man who had waited decades for this moment. More to the story your father made sure you'd never hear. Victoria wiped her eyes, steeling herself as Elijah pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age and careful preservation. Your father made sure I could never tell you what really happened that night, Elijah continued, his words causing the reporters to lean forward like vultures sensing carrion. After I got out of the hospital, he visited me exactly once, offered me $50,000 to disappear, to never contact you, to never tell anyone the truth about what I saw. No, Victoria shook her head in denial. My father wouldn't. He was grieving. I said no to his money, Elijah continued relentlessly. Told him I didn't want anything except for you to know that someone had cared enough to save you. That you mattered enough for a stranger to risk his life. Caleb stepped closer, his face ashen. Mrs. Sterling, maybe we should continue this conversation privately. Then your father threatened me, Elijah said, ignoring the interruption. Said if I ever tried to contact you, he'd have me arrested. Said nobody would believe a black janitor over a respected white businessman. And you know what? He was right. Victoria felt like she was drowning in revelations. What papers are in that envelope? Restraining order. Filed 3 days after I refused his money. Claimed I was harassing the family trying to extort money from a grieving widower. Elijah's voice carried 21 years of suppressed rage and hurt. That order stayed active until your father died 5 years ago. It's the only reason I could come here today without risking arrest. The room erupted with shouted questions from reporters, but Victoria could only hear the blood rushing in her ears as her entire understanding of her father, her family, her life rewrote itself. But there's something else, Victoria, Elijah said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something worse than abandoning the man who saved you. She looked up at him through her tears, not sure she could handle any more revelations. What could be worse than what you've already told me? Elijah's next words changed everything. Your mama didn't die in the fire, Victoria. A pause. She was already dead when the fire started. Dead silence fell over the room. Victoria felt like she was falling through space, through time, through every assumption she'd ever made about her life. The fire was set to cover up what really happened, Elijah continued, each word deliberate and devastating. Your father wasn't in Chicago that night like he told everyone. He was here, standing over your mama's body when I broke down that back door. Liar! Victoria screamed. But even as the word left her mouth, pieces began clicking into place. Her father's strange behavior around anniversaries, the way he'd never wanted to talk about her mother, the guilt that had lived behind his eyes for as long as she could remember. Your mama had discovered he was stealing from his clients, Elijah pressed on, knowing this might be his only chance to tell the complete truth. Retirement funds, life savings, kids' college money. She'd gathered all the evidence, and she was planning to turn him into the authorities the next morning. Victoria collapsed back into the recliner, the same chair where her father had spent countless evenings, and suddenly understood the weight he'd carried. So he killed her. And then set this house on fire, Elijah confirmed, hoping everything would burn away. The evidence, the body, the truth. And yes, including you. You were supposed to die that night, Victoria. You were the only witness who might someday remember something that could destroy him. The reporters erupted into chaos, but Victoria could barely hear them over the roar of understanding flooding her mind. 3 days later, Victoria stood on the steps of the FBI building. No designer armor, just a plain black dress, no makeup, nothing between her and the truth. 3 days ago, I learned that my entire life was built on a lie. She told the cameras, her voice steady as she laid out the murder, the fire, the theft, the cover-up. She held up her mother's documents and played Sarah Sterling's recording for the world. As majority owner and trustee of Sterling Enterprises, I'm initiating immediate liquidation. Every dollar, plus 21 years of compound interest, will go to the families my father stole from. They deserved justice 2 decades ago, and they'll have it now. A reporter shouted, Mrs. Sterling, why destroy your own life for crimes you didn't commit? Victoria looked straight into the lens. Because silence is complicity. Because 37 families deserved justice 21 years ago, and my comfort was never more important than their pain. Because my mother died trying to do the right thing, and I won't dishonor her sacrifice by choosing cowardice over conscience. Her eyes found Elijah at the back of the crowd. And because a hero named Elijah Brooks saved my life when I was 7. He risked everything for a little girl he barely knew, endured decades of silence, and I never got to say thank you. Well, Mr. Brooks, thank you. For saving me then, and for saving me again now. The crowd roared, but she raised her hand for silence. My childhood home will not be demolished. It will become the Sarah Sterling Foundation for Financial Crime Victims, and Mr. Elijah Brooks will serve as its first director. 6 months later, the house was reborn, and so was Victoria. She knelt on the warm yellow floor, helping her 5-year-old son Michael with a puzzle, as sunlight filled rooms once haunted by smoke. Photographs of the 37 families her father had wronged lined the walls, each one a story of justice reclaimed. Elijah sat in the chair that once symbolized lies, now simply a seat for an old hero. The Johnsons have their farm back. Mrs. Peterson can afford her medicine. The Williams boy. Medical school. Full tuition. Victoria, broke but finally at peace, whispered, "Just one regret, that it took me 21 years to say thank you." "Grandpa Elijah, will you tell me the story again?" Michael asked. Elijah's eyes filled with tears as he handed him the chipped music box. "This belonged to your mama. Now it's yours, so the music never stops." "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," filled the room, not with grief, but with love passed down, memory honored, and a promise finally kept. Victoria Sterling's story became more than headlines. It became proof that truth outlives lies, and courage outshines comfort. From her fall rose the Sarah Sterling Foundation, turning loss into justice for hundreds of families. And in that restored house, where pain once lived, healing now hums through generations. The greatest transformation of all, losing everything false to find everything real. And if this story of courage conquering comfort and truth outliving lies moved you, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice delayed but never denied. Because every voice matters, and every hero deserves to be remembered.